and welcome to the third program in the 2022 series of Consciousness Central. I'm your host, Nick Day. And in this program, we talk to Michael Ferguson about his research on neurospirituality, the science behind spiritual experience. We talk to Emma Hills about the neural correlates of shamanic states of consciousness. And we find out about an exciting breakthrough in quantum gravity computing that could have profound implications for quantum consciousness theory. And that's with James TAGG and Will REID. And finally, we talk to legendary American spiritual teacher and scientist SHINZEN about his vision for global transformation through an AI-supported meditation practice. All this and more in another packed edition of Consciousness Central. So I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central Michael Ferguson. Michael is from Harvard Medical School. He is a Harvard-trained neuroscientist and an academic pioneer in the field of something called neurospirituality. Well, I think we're hearing this term for the first time, at least here on Consciousness Central. So Michael, what is neurospirituality?
That is a great question. Neurospirituality, if you break it down, has the components of neuro and spirituality. Neuro is pretty obvious. It references the brain. Spirituality gets a little more tricky. The Oxford Handbook of Positive Psychology defines spirituality as the search for the sacred. Lots of different ways that we can talk about what is the sacred, what does it mean to be engaged in a search for the sacred. But if we zoom out and put together neuro with spirituality, basically I'm looking at the way that the human brain engages a search for the sacred.
So what happens? How do you do it? What are you measuring and how is it reported?
Sure, so there are a wide variety of methods that we can use for neurospirituality. Some of my earlier training was using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. In short, I would put people into brain scanners. I would have them perform spiritual and religious tasks like prayer or reading scripture, and then indicating in real time to me when they were having a peak religious experience, when they were feeling the spirit or having something that was unusual happen. And then I would look at those moments in time when they were having a peak spiritual experience to identify what are the correlations in the brain that are unique to these states. Really boiling it down, short answer is that there's a lot of activity, particularly in reward systems like the nucleus accumbens of the brain. I talk about this in greater detail in a TEDx talk called This Is Your Brain on God that's available on YouTube. Right now, though, I've stepped away from brain imaging correlates, and I'm really trying to get at causal sources of data. So looking at things like brain lesions from neurosurgery, or looking at types of brain stimulation, like deep brain surgical stimulation or transcranial magnetic stimulation. Ultimately, to answer the types of questions that I want to go after, we need to look at the causal basis for these phenomena, not only the correlations.
Okay, it's kind of interesting to just contemplate somebody being in an fMRI machine achieving that. That's quite a challenge, I would have thought.
It is, and I would say that the first study of this kind that I did, that in and of itself was, I think, the most important finding. The simple finding that even in such an unusual environment as the inside of an fMRI machine, people can still experience these states that they identify as particularly spiritual or sacred in nature. That alone was a win.
And does this sort of lead towards some kind of, I don't know, a practice or a pathway which can be applied sort of, across the population in some way, like using some scientifically based methodology, or do they already exist and we're simply describing them?
Yeah, so fantastic questions here. I love that you're thinking along these lines. The short answer is both.
Okay. Hey, we are complementarity.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of work by folks like Richie Davidson, Sarah Lazar, neuroscientists who have looked at practices like mindfulness, compassion meditation, have done an amazing service, both to science specifically, but to humanity generally. What they've done is they've looked at traditions that have been isolated for centuries. They've taken them on their own terms, and they've identified the ways in which these practices are impacting the human nervous system, which has a universal quality to it. You know, all of us have more in common with regard to our brains and our nervous biology than any of the things that differentiate us from one another. And so to look at something that has been so culturally specific of a wisdom practice and a tradition, to look at how it impacts something as universal as the human brain, does give us this path by which we can extract wisdom from a more narrow cultural tradition and understand some universal gift that it can offer to us on a broader scale. So that's really the hope that drives my approach with neurospirituality, is that by looking at these specific cultural traditions on their own terms, but applying these lenses of neuroscience that translate those specific cultural traditions into something of a universal code, that there may be a common good that can be expanded from that translational process.
So looking at the traditional way, you know, perhaps religions, the major religions and various practices that have built up over time there, does this, okay, so let's try and think of a way to phrase this question, because in a way we start treading into some interesting ground, don't we? You know, science is a secular pursuit, and religion is kept at arm's length. And a lot of people on the religious side are very, very eager to have science validate something going on there. So, science said this, therefore, well, there is a God, and we were right all along, and science says so, and that's kind of become the great arbiter of truth now. And to some degree, I think, you know, we have to see why that we see that. So I suppose my question is, it's a little bit of a fuzzy question, but we'll have a go, is how does this square now? How does this square the pursuit of science, as we understand it, with the experiential benefits or otherwise of religion?
All right,
where are we going with that?
I will try to give you a clear answer to your fuzzy question.
I know. Thank you, Michael.
I think that to a certain degree, it's okay for this to branch into multiple conversational streams. I think that, again, the idea that now this has to culminate in one singular conversation is a little bit too totalizing. I think that it's okay for us to have a variety of epistemologies. I think it's okay for us to have a variety of ontologies. And in fact, I would say that that's more than okay, that's actually desirable. If we look at evolution at a big picture level, diversity is such an important key ingredient. And so then for us to say, we're not going to learn from the wisdom of evolution, we're just going to homogenize everything, I think that there's a massive loss in there. There's a particular cultural flattening that I think is actually to our disadvantage. So on the one hand, I totally sympathize with this concern that some of these investigations may be abused in a particular way to try to artificially vindicate something that ultimately is unprovable. At the same time, I'm actually apprehensive about, again, rushing to the sense that now we ought to even have a singular, totalized epistemology or a singular, totalized way of thinking about the human experience.
Michael Ferguson, thank you very much for talking to us. This has been
pleasure.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, man. Thank you. So I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central Emma HUELS. Emma is from the University of Michigan. You are working as a neuroscientist, or you're doing some kind of neuroscientific research. Perhaps you could expand on that for me and tell me what you're doing.
Yes, absolutely. So I am a PhD candidate studying neuroscience. So I'm in my 4th year, and I work in the Department of Anesthesiology because anesthesiologists love to modulate neuroscience. They are really good at putting people to sleep, and so it's the perfect way to study consciousness. But we also are interested in kind of non-pharmacological states of consciousness that are can be more naturally induced as well. And so that's also what I studied and presented today.
Okay, so I see a title here was Neural Correlates of the Shamanic State of Consciousness. So can we just kind of define what that is?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So when we say neurocorrelates, we're really just trying to see what kind of changes are happening in the brain during different states of consciousness, whether it's sleep, anesthesia, or in this case, shamanic trance. And so shamanism, for anybody that doesn't know, it's one of the world's oldest spiritual practices, and it's originated in like indigenous cultures, where we have shamanic healers, and they can enter this state either through psychoactive substances such as like ayahuasca, or in what we did in our study using repetitive drumming. And so we recruited people who were shamanic practitioners, which means that there's kind of like this neo-shamanism movement where you have people who have trained in these traditions, but they're not necessarily from an indigenous culture. And we recruited them just from different shamanic practitioner conferences. And we studied their changes in brain activity and wanted to see how do changes in brain activity also relate to their self-reported changes in experience, because during shamanic trance, you can actually have changes in experience that are very similar to the psychedelic state, which is what got us interested in the first place.
Okay, so. And what happens? What do you learn? What do you see going on?
Yes. So I guess I'll start with the experiential aspect of these shamanic practitioners. So they can report a wide range of effects, kind of like with different psychedelics and different psychedelic drugs, you can have a variety of experiences. And so these shamanic practitioners will have feelings of disembodiment, such as like that they're flying. They'll see very intense visual images. They'll have feelings of insight or bliss or experiences of unity. And so we found all of that in the study, but whenever we looked at control participants during this repetitive drumming, we didn't see it there, so it's only happening in these shamanic practitioners. And we also looked at how did the experience of these shamanic practitioners compare to individuals in a different study that had received psychedelics, so either psilocybin, ketamine, or MDMA. And we found that their scores on this questionnaire we gave were very similar to the scores of these individuals that had received psychedelics. So previously, everybody kind of knew anecdotally that these were similar states, but we were able to actually compare quantitatively and say, hey, they're actually answering in a similar way on these questionnaires. And then in terms of their brain activity, we kind of just use a variety of fancy EEG techniques that are just kind of showing how different aspects of the brain are changing. And so we found that there's kind of these different EEG measures, such as complexity, which is just, how many different patterns are in the signal, or we can see how synchronized is the brain, or we can just see how much power is in the brain, such as how strong is the signal, how big is it. And we found that these measures changed in different ways during shamanic trance, only in these shamanic practitioners, and then it did correlate with some of these changes in experience, which was very exciting to see, because I think that everybody's really confident that psychedelics induce an altered state of consciousness, but sometimes I think people introduce some skepticism when we talk about non-pharmacologic states, and do people actually have these intense experiences, which, I mean, they do. According to the study, they do.
So what criteria would you say can identify somebody as a shaman?
Yes, so that's a great question. So for our study, we recruited people who had been a shamanic practitioner for 5 years, and they had to have completed at least 40 healing sessions. And I will say these healing sessions vary. Like shamanic practitioners they take inspiration from different shamanic traditions, from different spiritual traditions, even some pull from different like classical religions such as Christianity, Islam, etc. And so they had to have done these healing sessions, and they also had to be able to like enter the shamanic trance within 15 minutes. And the reason we did that is because if they took 3 hours, it's a really long time to try to study somebody. So not that we wanted to get right to the point, but we needed to make sure that we had some degree of limitations on how to study them. But I think there's a famous anthropologist, I believe he is, named Michael Harner. And he studied shamanism and actually became a shamanic practitioner. And he wrote a book called The Way of the Shaman. And in that book, he discusses how anyone can really become a shamanic practitioner with the proper training. Again, to differentiate between shamans, which are part of indigenous cultures, but you can learn these traditions and offer those healing practices to others.
So perhaps one comment that could be made is that the Western context does not necessarily produce the same kind of shaman, because it can't. It's simply because culturally that ground is not there, whereas somebody from sort of the rainforest of Peru might have a completely different cultural sort of ground to build on. Is that an issue at all, or not really?
So I would say It's an issue in terms of there is some concern about appropriation in terms of shamanic practitioners. You know, and you can even think about that with like psychedelic drugs as well, right? These are substances or practices that were taken from indigenous cultures, and people learned about them. And you know, on one hand, I can see that people are trying to spread these like healing practices and these drugs that have been used medicinally. But on the other hand, you are taking them from someone else who I don't know what their opinions are on our use of these practices and things like that. But I would agree that probably if you think of I'm obviously not a shaman and haven't really interacted with anybody from one of these indigenous cultures, but I would imagine that somebody who's actually within that environment and is like a shamanic healer, and that's very important to the tribe, that those experiences are different. Similar to how, you know, I can't just take people on an ayahuasca retreat. I'm not qualified to do that. Or really just any average person in the West really isn't qualified to do that, because I think that they don't have the same type of respect and experience. And it's really not part of that culture. You know, it's us learning about another culture, but me growing up in the West, and especially in the Midwest, you know, that's not part of how I grew up, but it's actually a way of their life. And I will say also in these indigenous cultures that they look to these shamans for all sorts of healing, whether it's physical healing, psychological healing, or spiritual healing. So when you're having a problem, you would go to these shamans, and they would work to heal you. And now, you know, in the West, I go to a doctor. Now, there are people who will go to shamanic practitioners for different healings, but it's not necessarily mainstream medicine, whereas it is in these other cultures.
Okay, so is there anything that you would like to add that you feel would be interesting? We have plenty already, but
yeah,
go ahead, by all means.
I think the only thing I wanted to note that I can't remember if I said it earlier is just like recognizing the indigenous cultures that did start and still perform these practices. And so I think that just in the era of how quickly everything's moving, and especially in the field of consciousness, and I think we all get excited, but I think it is important to always have respect for that as well. And yeah, I think that's about it. I'm just so excited to be here. I think it's been a great conference, and you know, everybody's been so lovely.
Oh, good. That's great. Well, welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is. It's a good conference. I've been coming for nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of change
Yes.
in that time. And it's great that this year there seems to be a lot of new people and first timers.
This was my first time, and
yeah.
I'll definitely be coming back.
Good, good.
Yes.
Well, it's a nice community. You know,
Yes.
you end up looking forward to, TSC comes around, everybody gets together, and you know, as you know, the
Yes.
conference circuit can be a lot of fun. So, and this one's a great one because everyone's so alive with the subject. You know, it's wonderful. Emma, thank you so much for joining us today on Consciousness Central, and hopefully we'll hear more from you in the future.
Yes,
Thanks a lot.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome.
Yeah.
What's your name?
My name is Frank Francis Cracciolo.
Okay, and what are we seeing here behind us? What have you brought to TSC?
We have brought to the Science of Consciousness Expo a phenomenal far infrared therapy. These saunas behind us generate frequencies of harmonic sunlight. So when it comes to consciousness, we are all about resonance and harmonics in the body. And what our saunas do is they're harmonizing and they're resonating water molecules to mobilize water to be better carriers of oxygen, to help cells be better carriers of oxygen and help the body detox deeply from environmental toxicity.
Okay, so now the people who've been sitting in here, we just saw some of them kind of blissed out. Is it a pleasurable thing?
Yes, it really activates the parasympathetic nervous system. You know, we activate on such a level of high stress and kind of hyper reality, being on our phones, being on our tablets, being on the internet all the time. We're kind of unplugging people and tuning them into their natural consciousness.
Now, of course, this being a Science of Consciousness, a kind of a science event here, I have to ask you, do you have data for all these?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you do. So this has all been studied and
by all means, the Japanese have been studying this for over 60 years.
Have they really? We didn't know
Absolutely.
that. So this is kind of new to the West, but that's something they've known about for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. The Japanese have been studying far infrared therapies for about 60 to 70 years. The original technology was essentially developed for premature babies to keep them warm. So far infrared is such a healing, soothing, vital frequency of sunlight. And like I said, it oxygenates the tissue and the muscles so well. For premature babies, circulation is everything, and obviously for adults as well. So keeping their core temperature up, keeping oxygen levels very high is essential. So we have something that's been adapted and evolved from Japanese technology to help out adults and children as well.
Excellent. Thank you for telling us all about it, and we wish you well with it. So I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central James Tagg and Will Reid. And James and Will are involved in some groundbreaking research, which we're going to find out about right now. So first of all, let me ask James, can you give us an outline, like a postcard version of what you're up to at the moment, which is kind of at the cutting edge, I gather?
Yeah, okay, so we've been trying to build a grand thing, which is like a quantum gravity computer, right? And that would require objective reduction to work. And the problem is, of course, that's an unproven theory. So we decided rather bravely or foolishly or whatever, that the first thing we needed to do is to prove that ORCO-R, or the objective reduction bit, does actually happen.
Right, okay, so could you just give us a little outline of what ORCO-R is at this point?
Well, so ORCO-R is a theory by Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose that what's in our brain is a quantum gravity sort of device, and the ORC bit is orchestration. It's like software, something actually has to happen. And the objective reduction is the fact that quantum things happen in your brain and they spontaneously collapse and they give you answers, or the answers come out of your mouth like this. Right, and so that was the idea. So the objective reduction part is the fact that if you have a superposition, that superposition needs to collapse for an objective reason. And people say, well, what do you mean objective? In the Copenhagen explanation of quantum mechanics, it's the observer. Someone looks at it, and because it's been observed, it sort of collapses. And then there are all sorts of paradoxes about Schrödinger's cat and Wigner's friend and so on. And Roger says, no, that's not what happens. What happens is that gravity causes the collapse, and so it just collapses spontaneously because it causes a paradox in space-time, and that can't be supported, and so it collapses. So what we were trying to do is see whether we can actually see that happen.
Okay, so am I right in saying, my understanding is that when you're talking about this collapse, it is, as Roger describes it, a bifurcation in space-time itself. It's the beginning of the peeling away of space-time, which then collapses. Is that how you'll describe it?
Yes.
You would? Excellent. Good. So we got that right. So we're all understood then. We all know what that means. We can all go home. Good. Okay. And now part of the point of this is that this collapse, as I understand it, is it's not the observer that consciousness is not somehow causing the collapse, but consciousness is the collapse. It's changing the locus of consciousness itself to the collapse in space-time.
Yeah, I mean that gets a complex, sort of subtle question. So
right.
we're trying to stay very, very boring physicists at the moment.
Okay.
And not go too
we
out
like
there,
boring.
Right? And so we're just saying, in order that ORCO-R happens in your brain and causes consciousness, the first thing is, does objective reduction happen? Mm-hmm. Right? Okay. And that is something you can go and test using laboratory equipment and optical equipment and oscilloscopes and things like that. You want to get into orchestration in the brain, you start needing to do wet biology experiments, which
right,
obviously lots of people are doing.
Okay.
So we decided to do a straightforward physical experiment with optics and so on.
So what does such an experiment actually look like in the real world? If we were to walk in and look at it, what do we see?
Well, let me give you the thought experiment one, because people understand this better, and I'll explain the real experiment, which is like, oh gosh, really, you did that? So the thought experiment is quite simple. So you know the double slit experiment?
Yes.
You shine a light through a double slit, and what you would expect to see is two lines, right? Two slits, but you don't. You get an interference pattern. Okay. So we said, well, what happens if you put two shutters on each of the slits? Okay. Now, if I just take my hands and open them, I'll get an interference pattern. If I close them, I'll get nothing. And if I open one of them, I'll get a slit. And if I close, it's very simple, right? So what we then said is, okay, let's take a single photon, right? We can make a single photon generator, And let's put that into a beam splitter, right? So we now have split it. And then let's have a detector that opens those two shutters. Now, if the photon comes through the beam splitter, it's in a 50-50 superposition, right? And then it goes, you know, through some apparatus and it opens these two shutters. Now, what you should therefore see is you should see an interference pattern because it opens, and then you've moved quite a lot of mass because the shutters are heavy. And so what will happen is that one will snap closed and the other one will stay open, and you'll get a beam. So you should see a little interference pattern followed by a bit of a, you know, a straight line, and that would be your experiment. So that's the easy way to explain it.
The easy problem. Will, just chime in whenever you can. What's your part in this? How do you...
So James, I've been working during COVID where we built this experiment in the garage.
Okay.
So we
That's
didn't
very
have
Silicon Valley kind of thing to do, isn't it?
access to lab space, so we've been thinking about it for a year or so and decided just to build it. And in the garage, we've started off with a small table, building the entire experiment, and slowly realizing we need this better equipment in here and building up. So we've got about 4 or 5 renditions I think we've been through now, and it's come a long way. So we've been able to reduce lots and lots of noise, and then got a positive result about a year ago that was looking promising, and then just a week ago our results came back again too. So we've still got some more work to do on it, but it's pretty exciting.
Okay.
And we're super excited about it.
Can you share what is exciting? Should we all be excited at this point?
I hope so.
Okay, well I am.
James
I'm sure everyone
yeah.
watching this is already very excited to hear what you're going to say next. So what are your results?
Well, so yeah, objective reduction is not a proven theory, it's just a theory. And what we did is make a much more complicated experiment than the one I just described with the shutters, but the principle is the same. And then we worked out a way that we can run the experiment with no superposition, and then run the experiment with superposition. And it's as simple as we just turn the laser off. So if you turn the laser off, our detectors detect dark count, you know, just noise in the environment. They just spontaneously kind of collapse, right? Well, they do spontaneously collapse, but they spontaneously give off impulses. But they're never at the same time. They're never superposed. They're completely random. So we have this nice random control, and then we turn the laser on, and now we get superposed photons, and they're superposed shutter openings. And we do indeed see the interference pattern to start with, and then we see the interference pattern go away. So that, and we see it go away in the same amount of time that was calculated in a paper by Roger Penrose and Yvette Fuentes, and I can't remember the name, but the Howell Fuentes Penrose paper, and we do see it collapse in that amount of time. So that would say that objective reduction is correct, and indeed it's Penrose correct, because it's called the Diosy-Penrose theory, and they're out by a factor of 2 from each other, and I think it looks like the Penrose explanation is the one that wins.
Wow, that actually is big.
Yeah.
It's big, isn't it? Is it? I think it is big, right?
Yeah.
It's a substantial discovery because, yes, I mean, Roger and Yvette and their collaborators are theoretical physicists, and they're doing it all with mathematics, and here you are, you've taken the material world and made it perform the way that they predict. So that's a fantastic outcome. Congratulations. So that's really good. Yeah. Really good. So is this an end in itself, or does this, where do you go now as successful practical physicists that you are?
So as anything like this goes, right, there'll be lots of people who are very skeptical of it.
For sure.
So we have lots of repeating the experiment, changing parameters, making things variable, plotting curves against curve, all that sort of stuff. But we've been doing this for a year now, so we can get the experiment to work, and we can get it to not work, and we kind of know what makes it tick. So we now have a lot more sort of proof to do. Other people have to duplicate it, so we'll publish a paper that gives all of the details and everything, and say, right, you can go and duplicate it as well. So we've got that to do. And then, of course, we had a starting point. We wanted to build a quantum gravity computer. So if you look at all of these quantum companies that are out there, and there are tons of them, right? The very first thing you do is you build a single gate, right? You just build one qubit of your system. So we're basically built one QG bit, quantum gravity bit, is our experiment. And now, of course, we'd like to multiply that up and build a quantum gravity computer out of it. So that was our original idea, and we just couldn't get people to believe in the idea or fund the idea or anything like that, because they said, well, this objectively, Penrose is a very, very smart guy.
Yes.
Very smart guy, but it could be wrong. So, it's just a theory. So the first thing to do was to show it wasn't just a theory, and then we can move forward and do interesting things with it.
James and Will, thank you so much for sharing all this stuff. This is kind of very, very exciting stuff. And intriguing, exciting. Yeah, thrilling, in fact. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Please come back and tell us more about it at a future TSC.
Of course.
Yes.
If by then you'll be arriving in your own helicopter, I'm sure. But okay,
We'll see.
Congratulations, both of you. Really well done. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right,
Bye.
James. Thanks, and Will. I would like to welcome to Consciousness Central Shinzen Yang. Shinzen Yang is an American meditation teacher. He leads Vipassana retreats, and he also has recently turned into a scientist. It was a very compelling, interesting idea. You've got this ground in Buddhism, and of course science and Buddhism are finding common ground. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to that?
Well, it started when I conceived of a passionate interest in Asian culture by seeing Japanese samurai movies when I was in my early teens. So that's quite a while ago, way before Asian culture would have been considered cool in some way by the mainstream of North America. It was not particularly cool. Made in Japan meant poor quality. It's that long ago. I got interested in Asia, and that led to my living as a Buddhist monk in Asia and in the Western world. And all along, though, on the side, sort of as an amateur, but a serious amateur, I was doing science, because I had this sense that if the systematic I'll call them, quote, internal technologies, the systematic internal technologies, meditation, mindfulness, contemplative practice, mystical, ascetic, theology type stuff, if that stuff was most systematically developed in the East, we have what was very systematically developed in the West, which is science. Now, really, though, science belongs to the whole world, big picture-wise. But there's a couple reasons why Western Europe has had a particularly strong role in the history of world science. So it's not really an East-West thing anymore. And actually, it never was an East-West thing, because contemplative practices exist all over the world, and science belongs to all humans. But there are these sort of historical accidents, and mindfulness and those ways of doing contemplative-based psychospiritual growth are very systematic in India and cultures influenced by India, China specifically, and therefore the rest of East Asia. So I thought, well, what happens if we bring the most systematic exploration of happiness that the East has done very well with the systematic exploration of happiness that would be modern science-centered, which maybe science isn't West, but it has a strong Western component because of Greece and then the Renaissance. And Islamic science is part of Western science, so that came in between. So the idea is, well, is there a grounds for a kind of transdisciplinary cross-fertilization? And it's quite a gap to mind, so to speak, like mind the gap. I mean, on one hand, it's ridiculous. I mean, meditation, mindfulness, well, that's meditation, and isn't that sort of monks and mysticism and religion and all that jazz? That doesn't sound very scientific. And then there's the scientific method and the fruits of the scientific method, and behind that, something that I would call the spirit of science.
Certainly the Buddhist approach to meditation does actually satisfy the questions of science. It's observable, repeatable, and measurable. You can measure it in terms of brain activity. You can have it, repeat it with, you know, across different populations. You know, there it is. It somehow checks the boxes, although what we're talking about is essentially something that is experienced subjectively. So in a way, Buddhism kind of checked the box, what, 2,000 years ago or something, or maybe Hinduism or whatever predated those traditions that spent a lot of time sitting under trees. You know, they definitely kind of, they found it somehow. And nowadays we're catching up. Here we are, you know, we've got neuroscientists checking all this stuff out.
Yeah.
So, I noted I was just sort of, you know, looking at the notes on some of the things that you've been doing. There's this thing showed up called unified mindfulness. Okay, unified mindfulness, and that is a new term to me. Could you help us understand what that is?
It's two things. It's a system of mindfulness practice, but it's also what I would call an ontology for contemplative-based psycho-spiritual growth across cultures and history. So it's like a framework within which you can place all practices that are sort of in the ballpark of mindfulness, meditation, contemplation, unitive consciousness, call it what you want. A general framework for that, an ontology in the sense that it's a taxonomy, a classification, a hierarchical classification. Here's the pieces, the sub-pieces, but then very clear relationships between the pieces, and that creates a knowledge system. So it is a fine-grained, comprehensive ontology that was designed for the use of science to study mindfulness in the broadest perspective. On the other hand, it's a standalone practice system, and someone can learn it either just by going to the internet and using materials, or you can be trained, and you can be trained to be a coach in it, once again off the internet. So it's another system of mindfulness like MBSR, the Mahasi lineage from 20th century Burma, the Uba Khin lineage also from 20th century Burma, numerous other ways of practicing. These are all broadly systematic mindfulness training programs, and so unified mindfulness is that too. So you can learn it, you can learn to teach it. What characterizes it is, I would say, many things, but the two biggest is it's meant to be implemented with a personal coach because it's a training. And the best way to be trained is to have a highly expert coach that is customizing their guidance. All their bandwidth is going to you. That's the best way to do any training. So it's meant to be implemented by first a human coach that has been trained, but then by an AI coach that's being supervised by a human coach. So we take the bulk of the energy needed and the information transfer needed to do the practice. The bulk of that is carried by advanced AI, so we can provide it for free for everyone in the world. Everyone gets a team of personalized, 24/7 interactive. You can just talk to them like any person, except it's a machine, because it's using transformer technology and perhaps even more esoteric things to come. So it's advanced AI, you just talk to it. But it's designed to bring every conversation eventually back to some helpful suggestions about how you can systematically train the skills and states needed to optimize your happiness.
Okay, well, we will leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to us today, Shinzen, and we'll have to see you again sometime, I hope. And I know you kind of work with Jay, and you know Jay is a friend here too, so this has been lovely.
Well, wonderful interview. Thanks for drawing this out. I totally enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Loving in my baby's eyes, loving in my baby's eyes, loving in my baby's eyes, loving in my baby's eyes. Late at night when I take my rest, I hold your picture to my breast. Love you, baby, now you know I do anything in the world for you. Loving in my baby's eyes, loving in my baby's eyes, loving in my baby's eyes, loving in my baby's eyes. I love you, baby. I love you, baby. Mama, now you know I do. Love you, baby. I love you, baby. Do anything for you.
And so that wraps our third program of Consciousness Central 2022. I hope you've enjoyed it. Be sure to join me for our final program, when we'll be catching up on the lively debate between Sue Blackmore and Deepak Chopra, respectively representing illusionism and idealism. We'll also be hearing about the latest in quantum consciousness theory and how philosophy intersects with robots, virtual reality, and the metaverse. Until then, this is Nick Day saying bye for now.
Thank you.